Hello and Merry Christmas, and please don't be concerned if my eyes look red. I just started to film a couple minutes ago and then had a terrible coughing fit. I have no idea where it came from, but my eyes are still watering. But anyway, I have a fun announcement. If you don't watch these normally, or if you don't watch all the way to the end, just listen up just for a minute or two. Christmas is my favorite time of year. You guys have been the best part of this year. Your support and your encouragement, your patience with me through this whole new platform that's not designed for writing and everything that comes along with that. So I wanted to give you something. I am still, for those of you who are in the top tier with the merchandise, I am still talking to Patreon. It turns out they did actually make a mistake. It was their system and their fault. And the reason that you haven't received your merch is because they messed up. But what that means is that the whole system is messed up now. So I've been talking to them about that. And it's going to be very complicated to fix it. So I've basically drawn a line in the sand and said, unless you can do this, we're done with this part. But I don't want you to be concerned. I have a plan. So I was going to try and get something to you for Christmas Day. I'm not sure if that's going to happen now. But I'm going to give you a little something that will reach you before Christmas Day. So please make sure that your address in the system is correct. If you are in a tier that is not receiving merchandise, please send me a private message with your address because there's something I'd like to send you. And for those of you who are in the tier where the merchandise has been messed up, I want to reassure you, you're either going to receive all of your merch very soon, or you're going to receive something that hopefully you'll like even better. But I'll let you know when I know exactly what's going on with Patreon. We got delayed a little bit by Thanksgiving. So all of you are getting a Christmas gift. Everybody who has supported me this year here on Patreon, I want to send you something. So please, like I say, make sure that the system either has your address and it's correct, or message it to me if the Patreon system doesn't ask for your address because you're not receiving merchandise in your tier. And I will do everything I can to make sure at least your little gift arrives before Christmas. But here we go. Questions for December. Merry Christmas, by the way. I can't remember if I said that at the beginning or not. This is my favorite time of year. So I get my tree and everything up the day after Thanksgiving, and then it stays up for a good week or two into January as well because I love it and I really struggle to say goodbye to Christmas time. But anyway, okay, here we go. Oh, I'm starting with the questions that are about me or about writing. So if you don't want book spoilers, I'll let you know when we're getting into the book questions, and you can, not listen to that part. The first question was from Nix, and she asked me what my favorite animal is. I'm assuming that's just me, my favorite animal as a person, not about the books. And the truth is, my favorite animal is and always has been horses. I grew up with horses. I rode, I showed. I used to teach. I worked at summer camps. I had my own horses from when I was 10 years old. But I haven't been able to have a horse for various reasons for over 20 years. So now I still sort of follow horse groups on Facebook and basically love them from afar. But we recently moved on to some land, not a huge amount, but enough I think that I could have a horse. So I still hope to have one again someday. We'll see. Caroline wanted to know. So we've talked a little bit about this in some of the past Q&As, but I think it was like a year ago or more. Anyway, Caroline had a lengthy question. Do you try out these fantastic sexy scenes before you write them to know if they'd work? So Mostly yes, but it's generally not, oh, let's give this a shot. Um, I've been with my husband for over 20 years. We've been married for over 20 years. We've been together for 24. Um, so I draw a great deal from my own experience. That's not to say that my sex life was like this, 20 years ago. This is something that we grew into. But also, there are some limitations. I am not a tall lady at all, and neither is my husband. He's only a couple inches taller than me. So there are certain limitations. There are some positions, very few, but a couple that we just physically couldn't do, either because I'm too heavy or he's too short or we're old. So some of this is drawing on past experience. Some of it is just things that I know just in talking to people. Um, Most of it comes from my experience in one way or another, but I have to say that I don't think it's the positions that my characters use that make the scenes. I don't think that's why people like them. I think it's more the experience of it, the physical sensations, the emotional connection, and that absolutely comes from my own experience. But again, it's not like I grab my husband and I'm like, oh, let's go try this thing. It's more that in our normal love life, I try to, or at least I draw on that. Remember things, think about things, try to figure out how to express things. I made a joke in Facebook recently where I said when things are good, sometimes I get distracted trying to think, how would I express that in a story? That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen every so often. Something really nice, or I'm just trying to think of new ways to express things, because the reality is there are limited physiological things that you can do or express or show that make those scenes feel real and connected. So sometimes I'm just looking for new ways to say the same old thing. Love scenes are hard. um, they are really beneficial, I think, to these stories, not just from a titillation, but actually because my goal has always been to demonstrate that emotional intimacy grows through physical intimacy. When two people trust each other and love each other and desire each other out of that place. So, there's lust, which anybody can feel for anybody. I'm trying to show lovemaking. I'm trying to show when two people trust and surrender to each other and aren't caught up in self-consciousness or performance, but they're actually giving to each other on an emotional level as well as a physical one. The thing that I think I draw on the most, actually, or at least I did at the beginning. My husband is quite a bit older than me. He's 11 years older than me, and came to our. I was a virgin when I met him, so he came to our relationship with a lot more experience than me. Um, and it's interesting over the years to talk to him and hear his perspective, because having had many lengthy relationships and encounters, he has a lot of contrasting experience. So it's very interesting. I always pay attention, sort of mentally note when he talks about things from the male perspective, because I think a lot of guys don't talk about that very much. So I think a lot of women don't really know, beyond the straight up desirability aspect, which men will talk about a great deal. The sort of mental, emotional side, I think a lot of women don't get to hear what a guy thinks about that or what his experience is as he grows and matures. And so it's been really helpful for me that, over the length of our relationship, which is very long, my husband has been quite open with me and discussed with me even before, well before the books. He has talked to me really since we met um, about just sort of the male perspective on all of this stuff. And in more, as we've grown older and become more mature, and our love has deepened, and our physical relationship has deepened, and our intimacy has deepened, he is a wealth of information, honestly, about how men connect physically and emotionally. Because I know it's a little bit of a stereotype. It was something that my mother used to talk to me about when I was younger, but it's proven true with my husband, at least, that for him, physical expression of love is a direct, I guess, barometer for his emotional state. That's not to say we can't just have fun sex. We do, and we can, and certainly have a lot. But there is something that happens, in my experience, when two people really trust each other, and are very emotionally vulnerable with each other. And that changes and deepens your physical connection. And we do. We have talked for years about how grateful we are that we have the kind of physical relationship that reflects that isn't just, it's not like emotions are over here and sex is over here, and you know, the two are very connected for us. And that can mean that, when things aren't great, it can it can affect your sex life. But what we've discovered is that because we have that vulnerability and that emotional connection, when we are struggling or we've argued or something's gone wrong, we can now use our physical connection to help us emotionally, draw us closer together when we're struggling, or if one of us has hurt the other, or just anything. Our physical relationship is very much a part of our emotional relationship. And that just seems natural, but it's not the way it always was. That's not to say we didn't have that early on, but we didn't have it the way we have it now. I mean, I think that's just growth and maturity, and for me, increased experience. Um, so yeah, it's the whole issue is very interesting to me, because I have a guy that'll talk about it. He's not a guy that will talk about it with other people, which I find hilarious. If you were to ask him questions, he comes across as very prudish. He's not at all. He's just embarrassed to talk about it with other people, but he'll talk to me. So I try to bring in and observe and listen and sort of note the stuff that he brings up, and bring that into the male characters. And one thing that's very, so like Reth and Tarkin both have lengthy previous experience with females, and then um, get into relationships or fall in love with women who don't have a great deal of experience. And in both cases, that's a sort of an issue that they have to discuss and address, and especially for Tarkin. But a lot of the things that I put in the minds and hearts of the guys in those kinds of scenarios come from conversations that I've had with my husband. Obviously, I'm not, it's not autobiographical, but I'm just saying I'm drawing on his expression of how he thinks about that, the things that he regrets, the things that he's glad for, the way that he thinks about it, and the general attitude of it's never ever been like this with anyone, genuinely 100% comes from him. He started to express that to me in our marriage, that he had observed, and it surprised him how sex was changed and improved, or the sexual experience, I should say, was changed and improved by emotional intimacy. And that was something, when we got married, he was 36, I think, 37. So he did not lack for experience, but he observed that in our relationship, there's an element of something that he's never had with anybody else. And I feel very confident and secure in that. I don't share the insecurities that the ladies, especially Hearth, does. But yeah, anyway, that's a lengthy answer to a not very lengthy question. Sorry, but you did have a second part. Oh, you said you remembered that my husband had helped me with a scene and I had a detailed visual. No, actually, what it was there was a position that my husband showed me like decades ago that I just assumed pretty much everybody did or had done at some point. And apparently not. Apparently, it's not commonly. A lot of people, when I described it in my first draft of the scene, I knew that it was a little bit more complicated than usual. And so I'd had 2 or 3 people kind of review the scene. And the only people that recognized it were the people who had done it before. And I found out that not very many people had, or at least percentage wise, it wasn't a high percentage of people. So I had another author kind of help me block it out, how to express which limbs went where, so that anybody who hadn't done it, could learn it, could understand, because it's a great position. But I had joked with my husband, or not joked, but I had told my husband about it. Hey, did you know a lot of people don't do that? And I had found a graphic, like a drawn silhouette of a couple doing that, so that if I still, even after reading, people didn't get it, I could send it to them and be like, this is what it is. But I do joke. I often joke about, oh, I need to go do some research. No, I'm not really researching. That's the truth. It's more just having fun and having a good time. I can only think of 2 or 3. There's some standing up positions that I haven't either haven't done or couldn't do now. But other than that, I can't think of anything that I've written that I haven't done myself. And I have done some standing up, just not as sort of intensely as I write it, because it's just physically with the body that I have and stuff, it's not easy. So, yeah. There's that. There's your shameless sex talk. Didn't think we were going to be starting out with that, but that was the order that I had the questions in. So good for me. Tessa asked me some questions about writing. How do you handle writer's block? I am very blessed that writer's block is extremely rare for me. And in fact, I can only think of one time in my life since I started writing professionally that I literally could not write, as in nothing would come. And it was when my mother was very sick. The doctors had given her 3 months, maybe up to 6, they said. She is still with us today, 4 years later, and healed. But there was a phase of about 9 or 10 months, because that process lasted for like 2 or 3 years. And there was a chunk where I was extremely productive in writing because I was kind of escaping into it. And then there was another time, sort of as things progressed, where my creativity I couldn't put anything out. I think what it was I had no more emotional energy left. So all I could do was take in. I couldn't put anything out, and I just couldn't write. And at that point, thankfully, because God knows what he's doing, I didn't have any contracts. I wasn't, I had a book that I had, or a couple books that I had been working on, but nothing, like I wasn't sort of committed to anything. So I just didn't write for several months. And then when it came back with a bang. Since I've been serializing, which is since August, well, really since Christmas, or December 2020, so 2 years, there's only been one book that I feel like I got blocked on. There have definitely been times on every single book that I write. There are times where it is a discipline to write. I was really, really blessed that very early on, before I had any contracts, before I was traditionally published, before I did anything except a blog, I got some very good advice from a publishing agent who said, writing needs to be a discipline. It needs to be something, if you're going to do it professionally, if you're going to try and get paid to write, it needs to be something that you train yourself to do, whether you feel like it or not. And he had a lengthy sort of diatribe about inspiration and how so many authors did this, oh, I'm not inspired, I just can't write. And his, having been in, at that point, traditional publishing, an extremely successful agent and author himself, he was like, you know what? That's because you haven't trained yourself to do it. It's not because you can't be inspired. It's because you've only ever followed the muse, so to speak. And he's very right. I have to say, I got that advice from him in, I think it was 2009 or 2010. And so now we're, 12 years down the line. I still see this all the time. Writers who want to write, have great ideas, have good skill, but well, I'm really busy, or well, I'm this, or well, I'm that. And that's true. Writing is something that you have to give time to. And I always tell authors, there are things in life more important than creativity. My family is more important than my work. If something's going on with my family and I can't get my words done that day, it's frustrating, but I'm never going to regret shutting my computer down and dealing with my child or my husband or my parents or whatever. I know that I'm never going to get 5 years down the line and go, gosh, I really wish that I had worked through that. I always tell people it's about discerning the difference between something that truly is more important or things that we just like and want to do. I honestly, to become a professional writer, I had to stop watching movies, stop watching TV every day, reduce greatly the amount that I read. Basically, a lot of the things that I did as my sort of relaxing time became writing time. And because I got that advice about writing becoming a discipline and some practical solutions when you are, because I do not get up every morning and go, I want to write. Most days I do enjoy writing, and at least a little bit. But my word count requirements are far higher than I would do for fun. So every day there's an element of discipline involved. And what I do, or what I've learned to do, is make sure that I have an outline or write an outline. If I have a scene coming up and I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out, and I'm struggling to write it, I start with an outline. I start just putting down ideas. This person's going to say this character's going to do this, reveal is going to happen or whatever. And what I find is as I start to kind of list or block out how this is going to come together, and I'm not trying to write it, I'm just getting ideas down. Dialogue will start to come, description will start to things will start showing up in my head, and then I'll just sort of naturally transition into actual writing. And if I get to a point where I'm hung up again, I go back to outlining. And the reason I do that is because I've learned how much faster I write when I kind of free my mind that way. It doesn't have to be good. It can be edited. All I have to do is get the story down, because then I can go back and fill in the pieces that are just outline or improve the dialogue or whatever. But until the words are on the page, I can't do anything with it. So when I am struggling, that's the process that I use. But I rarely struggle. That's the truth. Beyond just the pure, like, am I going to have to sit here at my computer for 2 more hours instead of going and watching a movie? Like, yes, of course I have those days. But what I think blocks most writers is that they have this idea that it's only fun to do the scene once. So they don't want to outline because they think, well, then I've discovered all the fun stuff that's going to happen, and now it's just not going to be fun anymore. And that, I think, is the biggest deception in creative writing. You don't discover all the nuance. You might know your milestones, you might know your reveals, you might know your surprises, But you will discover stuff on the way that you hadn't thought of before. And more importantly, if you plot ahead and outline ahead, you will come up with better ideas, because as you get further in the out, so I always have my stories basically plot, just skeleton plots when I start. I know how they're going to end when I start, and I usually know 2 or 3 of the big hooks in the middle. But as I write, I have detailed outlines for the next, say, 30 to 50 chapters, always. And the reason I do that is because when I get 50 chapters ahead and I have this great idea for this thing I'm going to do, often that needs to be foreshadowed much earlier in the story. And with serialization, it's already been published. If you wait until you get to that chapter, you can't foreshadow it. You can't come up with that great idea because you didn't set it up back, 100 chapters earlier, 50 chapters earlier. So plotting ahead, I think, is even more critical in serialization than it is in normal writing, because then you know what you're aiming for and you know the little hints you can drop without actually spelling it out, so that when they get to that moment that you had that great idea, they go, oh, that's what was going on in that thing, or that's why that said that. So how do I handle writer's block? I outline. I let myself, the saying that I learned in traditional publishing was, give yourself permission to be crap. I'm going to write this scene, I'm going to get words on the page, and they're going to be crap, but I can go back and make them better later. And generally what happens when you give yourself that freedom mentally, generally what happens is that what you write isn't crap, or at least certainly not all of it is. But even when it is, even when it's bad, or it's just outline, or it's just dialogue or whatever, it gives you something to work with and it makes it easier. And once you kind of get back into the flow of the story, usually you can start writing again. How do you know which flaws to give a character and which to not? So there's 2 aspects to that. One is that there is an element of inspiration in creative writing. And by inspiration, I mean, I believe that it comes from God. Not everybody would agree with that. But when I say this, what I mean is, there's an element of inspiration that I believe does not come from us. Something that gets spurred or drawn out or communicated through us. And so sometimes, in fact, I would say often for me, the blanket of who my characters are just appears. I have an idea about a type of person or a type of relationship or a type of conflict. And as I think about that idea, the type of person it would need to tell that story becomes very clear to me. I've been developing characters without realizing it since I was a little kid, and I mean little, 5, 6 years old, because I've always had an imagination, and my most fun thing to do as a child was to make things up. I didn't know that I was preparing for storytelling. I just thought I was playing. And perhaps even more importantly, it's the way I've always fallen asleep. Even to this day, I fall asleep building stories in my head. But especially when I was sort of 10 to 15, 20, those years, it was often how I got my mind to shut off from the day or the angst or the emotion or whatever. I would build a story in my head and I would make myself the protagonist because that's what teenagers do. And so without realizing it, I've been developing, I guess, the muscles to create characters for decades. Nowadays, I have a lot more intentional tools and skills. Again, if you plot ahead and you know what your ending is that you're aiming for, you know what some of your twists are going to be, you need certain kinds of people to create those conflicts. So that informs, to a certain degree, what type of flaws a character would have. But I think the biggest element for me is that I'm just fascinated by people, and I always have been. And so, for example, the book, which is now called My Hollywood Ex-Boyfriend Wants Me Back. I wrote that book. It was called Love Out Loud, and it was written for the traditional market. It's not done well in serialization, but it has some of the best male characters I've ever written in it. And so the two main leads in that story, the male leads, are a rock singer and musician and his best friend who's the drummer and a musician. And immediately when you start with that premise, I know those guys. I know the rock, hard, tattooed, funny, but a little bit closed off. And, that like there's a stereotypical, I guess, archetype of the character, first of all, that you start with. And then you go, okay, so what's their major conflict going to be? Where's the story going? What do they need to have happen to them, or what kind of person do they need to be to make that happen? That's how I build it. But very often, I mean, truly very often, when I first start thinking about a story, the characters come already partially fleshed out. They just are in my head with pieces of themselves already in place. But I also change them sometimes. Sometimes I build them when I realize the story needs something. So it's a combination. And I think that that's a really cool question, probably way more interesting to me than it is to you. What's your favorite supporting character that doesn't get much page space that you would write a side novel about if you could? And Tessa has reassured me that she's not going to ask me to commit to writing it. She'd just like to know which one. I go back and forth on this. Tommy from that book, My Hollywood Ex-Boyfriend, to me is the most likely character and most fully realized to become a romantic hero. And I wish that there was an audience for that story, because I always wanted to tell his story. In the Animus series, of course, I've ended up giving my favorite side. I would love to give Gar his own book, honestly, just because I love being in his head. He makes me laugh, and I fall in love with him all the time. He's just a wonderful, wonderful guy. But he gets plenty of page time. I'm trying to think who didn't get page time that I would love. And you're all going to say you want this, and I'm just telling you we're not going to do it. But I would love to have written Yet's story from Rise of the Dark Alpha, because Yet is such a sweetheart. But his story would be so, like, not eventful. It would just be this sweet, cute guy, Anyway, okay. So the ones that I wanted to write the most and actually sort of planned to was Philippe and Borsch from Loving the Forbidden Prince. Would have loved to write their stories. I got to dabble in one of them right at the end of the book. But yeah, those two guys, I love those two men. Like, I love those characters. But also they have very interesting backgrounds and very interesting sort of emotional journeys in their lives. So I wish I could write them. Why do you hate vampires? Why do you hate vampires? I don't hate vampires. What it is I don't find the concept of vampirism or being a vampire romantic. I don't understand people's obsession with vampires. That is the pure truth. There's a form of vampire that I've actually wanted to write for a long time. I don't know if I ever will, because I don't know if people will go for it. But the traditional blood-sucking immortal guy, I just don't get it. I don't get what's sexy about that. It does not appeal to me at all. The immortality thing I get. I understand why people want that as part of the story. I've never understood why the blood-sucking thing is sexy. Never. I think it must just be sort of the superhero aspect of these characters. I love me a guy who's bigger and stronger and faster than everybody else, as you know. But no, vampires they just don't float my boat. Like, I can think of so many more fun things that I could write a hero to be. But that's just me. Like, I don't have any issue. And I loved Twilight. When that whole series happened, I was in with both feet all the way up to my eyeballs. Loved it. But it had nothing to do with them being vampires. It was the way she told the story and the um just the whole setup. I loved the romance of it. I now have issues with that book that I didn't used to have, but back when it was happening, I was really into it. And so I don't have an issue with vampires per se. It's more that they don't draw me. So if a book is about vampires, I'm probably not going to pick it up. Where are your water characters? For a lover of water, you don't have many water creature shifters. So there's a really, really practical reason for this. None of my main characters are water characters. And so without having a point of view character in the water, it's really hard to write a water character. We got to see, and this is coming out of Rise of the Dark Alpha. For those of you who have not read that book, there is one scene where it's explored and explained that there are water chimera, but we never really get to see in depth into that world, and we don't get to explore it, and there's no point of view characters that we see. And this is super practical. Characters that have to live in the water, have to be in the water, that's very limiting for a story, pure and simple. So, we can't have oxygen breathing characters in the water with them. That makes it hard. You can't talk underwater. Like, short of creating my own breed of mermaid, I don't see how I could really build a story significantly in the water. But yes, I do love water. I love it a lot. So sorry, that's why. It's just purely practical. So these questions are about specific books, and I think they're mostly, we're in the anima / chimera world. So if you're reading Warrior Beast, hopefully you're reading it here on Patreon and you're right up to date with it. If not, just be forewarned. I'm also going to answer a couple of questions about King and Queen. So Randy wanted to know who the Alpha of the Lion Pride is when Reth and Elrith are rulers. I thought that I explained this in King, but maybe I didn't. They are Reth is the Alpha of the Pride when he is king. The buck stops with him, but because of his roles, he basically has people in place that fill that for him. This is probably coming out of the question around when Elrith was appointed or took dominance, and she didn't want Aaron to be the alpha. It's not because, okay, how do I explain this? She didn't want, people have raised this a couple different times, and there was a specific issue there. She wanted Aaron, or felt that she needed Aaron as her advisor. Being the dominance advisor is a very, very intensive present role. So it's not where you have a ruler who's already making decisions, who's already, building strategy, all of that. Being alpha of the pride and alpha of all, you're really making the same decisions most of the time, right? So having those two roles, they don't conflict. As alpha of the lions, Reth is bringing the lions along on any decision or any strategy that he is putting in place for everybody. Same with Elrith. But they do have people in place that are kind of their go-to or their proxy If there's a meeting they can't get to or information has to go out, like they have seconds, they have people in place, they have a whole structure. There's a whole society and a hierarchy in every tribe. So, and the reason I didn't get in depth into those things in the Anima books is because you're seeing the core, or where the important decisions are being made because of who the stories revolve around. But with Aaron's situation in Queen, for the advisor is specifically supposed to be a person who will challenge, who will stretch, who will play devil's advocate or bring information that the alpha doesn't have, to make sure that the decisions they're making are right and true. That person can't be tied to another role because that's going to inform or change how they advise, right? Elrith didn't think Aaron could do both jobs because she saw them conflicting, primarily in time. Primarily because as advisor, that is a different role and requires a different engagement with everything that's going on than the alpha of the disformed. So her resistance to that had to do with she wasn't fully going to get her advisor, and the disformed weren't fully going to get their alpha. Everybody was going to kind of half-ass it, because it was just, he just wasn't going to have the time to do both. So I don't think I explained that very well in the story, because as that was happening, other things were ramping up. There's several little nuances like that that I wish I had explained better in the storytelling, because I have had a lot of questions about that. But just that's how it all came together in my head, at least, was that the advisor can't be the alpha because they have different roles to play and different time commitments. Will we get to see, this is a Patreon question, or at least Patreon story extra. Will we get to see Reth and Gar's conversation when they were saying goodbye from Gar's perspective? So hopefully you read last month the side stories, and you got to see Reth. Okay, so here's spoiler alert. If you haven't read the side stories, the material is here on Patreon. Scan back and go find it, because this is a really, really cool part of what happened, and I'm going to spoil it for you if you don't. In the side story for Queen, Reth and Elia get to return for a night. The creator makes it possible that every year on the Feast of Reunion, they'll be able to return to Wildwood, see their family, meet their grandchildren, all of this kind of thing. And the first time that happens is 7 years after the end of Queen. And so there's the side story for Elrith is about her parents appearing and the family being able to have the Feast of Reunion together and then stay up all night talking. When Reth and Elia appear and everybody is leaving the cave, Reth runs out with his grandson and sees Gar, and they have a reunion moment. And then there's another moment later that night after the feast where they're walking back to the royal cave, and Reth wants to have a conversation with Gar by himself. So I'm assuming that that's the conversation that Ceranthe is asking about, but there's actually two that they have. There's two moments that they have alone. I kind of go back and forth. I want to tell the stories, but the reality is there's not, all it would be a meaningful conversation between Reth and Gar. Reth has insight, just like he did with Elrith. You got to see Reth's conversation that night with Elrith by herself. It's a similar thing where it's just about being a dad, really, and recognizing something that you need and wanting to give it. So yes, on the one hand, I'm like, ooh, I want to tell the story. but because it's meaningful for me, like having the characters. I love Gar, and the whole dynamic between him and Reth was always so up and down. So I always love the moments when they're really together. So from that perspective, yes, I probably will, or I certainly would like to write it one day. But the complication is there's one element to that conversation that you don't yet know about Gar's life. So hence, basically, I can't tell you that story until either we're using it to show you that, or that's been revealed already in other material. So maybe that's your answer. Maybe. Will we know who Duncan's mate is? Maybe. I haven't yet decided how deep I'm going to go in Warrior Beast. My focus for now, as the book is growing, is to get the main story told, which is Tarkin and Hearth and the people immediately around them with Sasha and Zeb. So there's a very specific place that we're going to with that story, very specific conflicts. You will get to see, for those of you who just read the mass release at the beginning of the month, you already know, spoiler alert, you already know that Jaya and Skull are mates and have discovered each other. I don't anticipate, I'm not sure if I'm going into any more perspective characters, narrator characters, but you'll definitely get to see other pairs. You'll get to see other mate bonds occurring or being discovered. I don't know how many of those stories I'm going to be able to tell, so to speak. It's going to depend on how successful the book is. Web Novel are definitely supporting this book. Like, they are working hard to make it make money because it's not making very much money. But that is more of a reflection of the way that the audience on Web Novel has changed, and there's not as many paying readers as there used to be and stuff like that. So if the book takes off and becomes a solid earner, one of the ways that I'll increase the material is to tell some of these other stories, and then you would get to see something like Duncan's story and May's story and stuff like that. But if it's not, if the book isn't, like, it's not making enough money to sort of sustain that, I'll keep the story much tighter so that you get the full plot development and, the main characters get their resolutions. But maybe we do that other stuff as some extras, or at least some little snippets of it. After the Human War, when all the protectors got their beasts, did Gary get his beast too? So, massive spoiler alert. If you have not read the rest of Queen, if you have not got to the end of that story, turn this off now. Because the biggest plot development I've ever written is about to be revealed. So if you remember, the end of Queen, Gari comes back to Wildwood. He has to inform Reth and Elia of their role in the story, and he and Callie have the same role, so each couple is going to go close the portals. And they're killed in the process of that. So Gari would have gotten his horse, but he died. So, I mean, technically, no, he didn't, because he passed away before that transition happened. What was happening there, the disformed, as we knew them in King and Queen, or early in Queen, they are a facet of the anima that the creator specifically chose, gave them the skills and equipment to deal with the voices. Some people would walk into that and some people wouldn't. This is like a spiritual reflection of real life for me. I believe God gives everybody gifts, talents, ways that they think that can be beneficial to others. Some people choose to follow the paths that they were created to follow, and some people don't. So the same is true of the disformed. They are created with the capacity to be people of great integrity, very strong character, very single-minded, and willing to stand against a crowd. Some of them follow that, some of them don't. The ones that follow that kind of give themselves over to that, those are the ones that would be protectors. And what I kind of hopefully led you to see as Gari and Callie discovered things at the end of King and also in Queen with some of the stuff that was shared. What has happened historically for the anima is that the protectors used to be recognized for this. They used to be known to be these people. There was because they smell slightly different. They can't shift. They were known. They were understood that this was their role, hundreds of years earlier. And then the prophecy came, and the prophecy made it very clear that if that knowledge and understanding was to continue, it was going to get in the way, and that they wouldn't be able to win. So they created amongst themselves over the course of 2 generations the ignorance of who the protectors are, what they were created to do, and why. So when we get to King, they're just disformed. Nobody understands what these people are supposed to be. Nobody understands their ancestry. Nobody's got the prophecy. And that's Gari's role. He is somebody who has stepped into what he was created to be. He has the integrity, he has the character, he has the strength of will to stand against the crowd. And so he's given the task to bring that prophecy forward, and everybody gets to learn who the protectors really are. When the portals are closed, there's no longer a need for that particular type of defender of the people. They were created with a specific role in mind, and in order to develop them and who they are and the character that they needed, and also to give them the sense of I want to say solidity, they were blocked from shifting. The creator made them in a way where they couldn't shift. After the portals are closed, the creator gives them that back. This is a reward for what they've done, for what they are. It's the next sort of season of what they're supposed to be. So now you have this whole percentage of the population who can shift, but they shift slightly differently. And I'm not going to get into that now, because I said after Queen there was never going to be another story, right? But yeah, there has been. So now I never say never, because I don't know if there's ever going to be another anima story. I'm not going to tell you the ins and outs of the differences of the protectors, but just know that there is one. There's a difference in the way that they shift and why. Gari would have gotten that if he had lived through what he did, but he was well rewarded for his role in all of that. And then last question, in Warrior Beast, did you have planned out before you knew about blending Thana and Anima together, or did you always plan his story that way? So, Tarkin's story. Planned out before okay, so I didn't know. No, okay, right. So I understand now. Did I always know Tarkin was going to marry a chimera and be mated to a chimera? No. I knew that he was going to be mated to a woman or a female that had not grown up in Wildwood. I had back when I was writing King and I first introduced him and he became loved, and then in Queen, because I still didn't know when I started Queen and Tarkin was so central to the story. I did want to write his story, but I still hadn't yet in my mind brought the anima and the chimera together. So when I said at the beginning of Rise of the Dark Alpha that there was no connection between the two, I meant it. That was true. When I planned Thana and Sasha and Zev's freedom, I did not plan it to be Anima. I didn't know that was going to happen. But when I got to the writing of it, it was right at the same time that I was writing Queen and the Anima were freeing themselves of the humans. And duh, I can't believe that I never saw that. But I have to say, I think it worked because I think it stopped people from making that connection. There were two people that I know of that made that connection before I wrote it. There was probably more. But there were two people that talked about it. But there was truly, in my mind, no intention when I wrote Zev and Sasha to bring them to Anima. That was not the goal. It was to get them to safety was the goal. So when I was writing Queen, and my next options were Laren and Tarkin. Laren I ended up bringing into the end of King, and because Queen at that point wasn't doing very well, and so I thought rather than telling his story separately, I'll tell it in this environment. And then that pushed me towards Tarkin, and I knew that it had to be somebody who hadn't grown up with him, because he would have known. They would have figured it out well before. I mean, the guy's nearly 40 years old at the beginning of Warrior Beast. I don't talk about that because that puts a lot of young people off. But the reality is he's not a dumb guy, and he's been looking for his mate. So it had to be somebody that hadn't been in Wildwood. I'd always intended for that. I had a different idea of how I was going to bring a different people, right? But then when we got to the Thana Chimera thing, it was like, oh, look, it all fits. It all works. So I just shifted where she came from. But I still kept this character that you hadn't met or seen before because that was who she needs to be for him. But it brings this whole new sort of depth to it, that there's an entire story behind Zev and Sasha instead of it being just some random people that are a threat. So the structure of the story, like the setup of who she is and how he finds her and all of that kind of thing, I definitely didn't have all of that figured out when I was writing Queen. No. I just knew she had to be somebody that wasn't in Wildwood, and I had an idea of how I was going to do that. But the dynamic between him and her, and the battle for him between loyalty to his queen and his people versus loyalty to his mate, that was always going to be the sort of the main thrust of his story. I just got to add some cool stuff with her being Chimera. So I hope that answers the question. I've been talking for a really long time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you for being here. If you got this far, good for you. You're awesome. I will talk to you next month. I hope you have a really wonderful Christmas or holiday season if you don't celebrate Christmas. And thank you. Thank you for being here and being a part of my world and my season, because it's been really wonderful. I'm very grateful. I will talk to you next month.